So let's take care of the sparks. We'll also create a light mesh for the sparks. So I'm going to go here and we'll do pretty much the same thing. I'm going to grab these two, put them here, and we'll give some thickness to those sparks. So we have our polywire working. But in the case of the sparks, if you notice, if you select this one and middle mouse button on it, you'll see that we have a width attribute somewhere. We have three more, so I'm going to hit Control, click, three more, and we have a width attribute. And we're going to use that to control the wire radius. So at width, and let's have a look. And you get this. So we need to go up here to the spark trail. So we need to bring this down 0.002. And now we have some little sparks in there. Let's look at this from the camera. So we have an idea of the distance. Still a bit too much. So I'm going to bring this down a bit further. And I think this is enough. This is what we're going to be using for lighting. It does have enough resolution, and I might go ahead and just subdivide anyway, so we have some more a bit rounder areas at the end. Let's see how this looks with the subdivide. Okay, so I think this shape will be better, so I'm going to keep this, and this will be the out sparks light mesh. I'm going to go up, create a copy of this one, and say sparks. As for the color on this one, I'm going to use a uniform color, and I'm just going to use plain orange. Maybe not saturated, and probably higher. I'm going to push it more towards the orange, something like this. Now we have those sparks. We need to select the proper mesh on this one. So it's an area light, but we need to select the other mesh. And we should have here sparks light mesh, accept. And let's create one render specific for the sparks. We can test it out on the robot as well. Let's check it out on the robot first. So I'm going to go to objects. Actually, I'll just create a copy of this for testing, and I'll call this tester. No need for us to stop or change the configuration of that one. Tester, IPR. And on this tester, I just want the robot. And then I want to have a look at just this slide. Control C, Control A, Control V. I'm going to go back to the camera. If you make this visible, you should see the mesh. I'm going to hit W here. And once we have that, this one is set to visible as well. We're not going to be having this light be visible, but for now, let's try it like this. The intensity should be okay. Let's start with 0. I think this will work. So let's render this out. Render view and hit render. And there we have our sparks and the light contribution of those sparks. Now, there are many ways we can go about doing or organizing our renders. In this case, we could do one separate render of just the sparks so that we could have we could have the render of the robot, apply the sparks on it, and then on top of that we would have the blast. That's definitely one way to go, and I'm very inclined to follow that. So yeah, the only difference is going to be that instead of having the sparks rendered as a light mesh, I also want to show you how you can render the sparks without using a light mesh. So instead, we'll go here to the render sparks. and we'll go to render redshift object strands and render object as strands. We do have a multiplier for the scale that's going to be useful for us to fine tune the values of width that this already has, and that should be the only thing we need to adjust. We also need to create a material for this, so let's go ahead and create one material here on the shader effects specific for the sparks. I'm going to change this, call it sparks. This is what I'll be using, and inside here I'm just going to use the same incandescent material, but we're just going to be using the color. Same thing, the opacity, I'm not going to use anything on the opacity channel. I'll just make sure to have a high intensity multiplier, so 2 should be okay. And let's see what this gives us. Make sure we apply the shader to the sparks here. And let's test that out with a different render. So on this test, what I'm going to be doing is I'm not going to render the robot. I'm just going to render the sparks, RNDR sparks. Make sure to fix this name. And so let's just have a look at those sparks. For the lights here, I'm going to take these off, and we'll see that something will happen. By default, Redshift will create a light if you don't have any lights in there. So I'm just going to make sure to add one of these. Control C, candidate lights. They're going to be at 0, 0, 0, and it's very weak, so it's not going to give us any influence on the scene anyway. So, but that way, not here, but on the lights. That way it's there, and that it's enough for us to have Redshift not create those default lights. So let's have a look at this. I'm gonna actually save this one out and hit render. So here we have our sparks. They are very thick. We're not even cutting out with the robot as a matte. That's something we would definitely do. So we would go here to the force matte. We would put RNDR robot, and on get params from, we would use the sphere, same thing, and that way we get the cutout from the robot. Okay, so this is how we would render the sparks. No motion blur, so redshift, camera, motion blur disabled. We talked about this, so we already have the trail. If you add motion blur, it's not going to be too relevant because the camera is moving really slowly. So what I want to adjust is the thickness, and that's something that I'm going to be doing on the actual node here on the section for strands. I'm going to reduce this to 0.2, do another render. Let me turn off motion blur. So this seems more of an appropriate scale for the sparks. We can definitely render these separately, or we can have this be rendered with the light as well. So let's see, let's say you want to have one pass of your renders will be the robot being affected by the sparks and with the sparks visible. And that way we can comp one thing on top of the other later. So the way we would do that is here on the objects, we don't need this one. We will instead use the LGT RS mesh sparks in the force lights. The robot is going to be, we wouldn't want the robot in matte in this case. So we would grab this, put it here. And we would like to exclude this object from these lights. So you would go here to the object section and just exclude the RNDR sparks. So let's make sure we exclude from both lights and shadows, and let's press render. So we have our sparks, which are going to be visible. This light needs to be not visible. So here on the lights, make sure you turn off visibility. And what we'll get is we'll get this light contribution coming from the light mesh of the sparks, but what we'll be seeing rendered is the actual robot with the sparks as well. Okay, let's say CG effects sparks, and I'm gonna use this to render the sparks. Control C, Control V, Redshift. We do have AOVs here. I'm gonna add another one. So what I'm looking for is emission, and let's see what this gives us with the emission. So exactly the same, but we should have an emission pass that just gives us the sparks. Okay, so we do have some color variation. We will have the emission available as well, but we do have some nice color variation. That's pretty interesting to have actually. I'm gonna go with this. So I'll keep rendering the sparks. I made the mesh the mesh light, the light mesh not visible, and I played with adjusted the intensity on the shader. The intensity is now at 4, which gives you more color richness. This is also because I have emission. I can also always increase or decrease these values. Okay, so now that we have our sparks, just make sure that the light has its own group, AOV light group. At this point, we're pretty much ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to be preparing the final render settings and fine tuning that and finally submitting the renders.